Just this past week, the Palestinians launched a massive rocket attack on Israel. Israel, fortunately, has one of the most advanced missile defense systems in the world, so I'm not sure if any of the rockets even reached the ground. The Palestinians, however, don't have such capabilities, and Israel's response probably cost innocent Palestinians their lives. When war comes, it affects everyone, whether they're soldiers or peaceful citizens. In this message, I'll lay out why there's so much conflict in the Middle East and give a brief summary of how it all began as it relates to Bible prophecy. This is the Matthew 7 Project, and this message is entitled Tensions in Israel and Bible Prophecy. A few years ago, a professor at a prominent Christian college was suspended for suggesting that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. Her suspension sparked protest on campus, but was it justified? Do you think Christians and Muslims worship the same God? Obviously, the administration at the college didn't think so. Well, let me start with a brief history of God's chosen people and the Promised Land. Now, I'm doing this from memory, so if I make a mistake, please blame it on my head and not my heart. Just drop a comment with any corrections you think need to be made. Abraham is said to be the father of all omnitheistic religions, which means people who believe in one God. Abraham is the one that God originally made the covenant promise to. The top 3 religions on the planet all trace their roots to God through Abraham. Jews and Christians through Abraham's son Isaac, and Muslims through his son Ishmael. The first thing to note is the Bible weaves together like a good quilt. Oftentimes, situations repeat over generations. It's like an unspoken symmetry to it. I believe that symmetry is God's way of teaching us to learn from our past. The first such symmetry starts with Abraham's 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael was the firstborn son of Abraham. According to custom, the firstborn son is special. He's the one that receives a double portion of the inheritance, and you would assume that the promise of God would follow the firstborn son. But that's not what happened. Ishmael was born to Hagar, a servant of Abraham's wife. The Bible prophesies of Ishmael, saying that he will be a wild man, and his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with his kin. This prophecy is speaking of his descendants as much as it's speaking of Ishmael. It's basically saying that the Muslim nation will be at odds against their Christian and Jewish brothers, and this conflict and tension will exist for generations. Indeed, this prophecy has clearly been fulfilled because Palestinian Muslims and Jewish Israelites are still fighting to this day. Literally thousands of years later, Abraham and Ishmael are very important in Islam. According to Islamic history, the Kaaba in Mecca was built by Abraham and Ishmael. It's also said to be where Ishmael and his mother Hagar are buried. What's amazing is, even though Ishmael is not technically the chosen seed, he's still given the same promise as his father Abraham. An angel of the Lord tells Hagar in Genesis 16:10, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count, which is the same promise God made to Abraham. Just think about that for a second. God promises that Muslims and Jews will both grow into great nations. Let me move on, though. At some point, Abraham's wife, Sarah, gets jealous of Hagar, and Abraham eventually has to send Ishmael and Hagar away. Sarah then has Isaac, the chosen son. Isaac is the one that Abraham is about to sacrifice on the mountain as a show of faith, and God stops him at the last minute. I'm sure most of you have heard that story before. Think about the symmetry here, though. God asked Abraham to make the same sacrifice that he would eventually make for us. I imagine God saying, if Abraham will sacrifice his son for me, then I will sacrifice my son for all of them. Fast forward a bit, and Abraham's son Isaac has 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Well, the same thing that happened between Ishmael and Isaac happens between Jacob and Esau. Esau is the firstborn, but he doesn't inherit the birthright. Instead, he gives up his birthright for a bowl of soup, and the promise of God falls to his second son, Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. They're called the children of Israel. And here again is another bit of symmetry. Ishmael had 12 sons. Also, just as a side note, Jesus had 12 disciples. So all three major religions are represented here by this number 12. Jews through Jacob, Muslims through Ishmael, and Christians through Jesus. The Bible says that Jacob wrestled with God. Then God changes his name to Israel. For the sake of simplicity, though, I will keep referring to Israel as Jacob so we don't get the man confused with the nation. Of Jacob's 12 sons, his son Joseph is special. He's the favorite son. His older brothers get so jealous of him that they sell Joseph into slavery. After a series of events, Joseph ends up being second in command over all of Egypt. A great famine spreads throughout the Middle East, and the Israelites end up migrating to Egypt in search of food, and they are reunited with Joseph. This is a common theme with the Israelites. Whenever there's famine or problems, they flee west to neighboring Egypt and parts of Africa. Some years later, Joseph dies, and at this point, Egypt has a new pharaoh with no connection to the Israelites living in his land, and they're growing at a rate that would eventually outnumber the Egyptian population. So what does Pharaoh do? He enslaves the Israelites and kills off all the male children being born. Thus begins the story of Moses. Moses leads the people out of Egypt back to their promised land. And even though God promised this land to the Israelites, it was occupied. Now here's the money verse. God tells the Israelites, I will drive the people out and you shall possess the land. This is the verse that the Jewish nation points to as their claim of ownership to the land of Israel, even to this day. It makes sense, right? If God gives you something, it's yours, and only God has a right to take it away. Well, that's kind of what happened. I know this summary is a bit long, but it's a heck of a lot shorter than reading all those chapters. I promise you, if you stay till the end, this video is jammed packed with valuable historical and biblical information that you don't want to miss. So let's continue. The Promised Land was divided into 12 territories, one section of land for each of Jacob's 12 sons. But Joseph's tribe got a double portion, which fell to his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who are half Egyptian. I only point that out to dispel the notion that all God's chosen people were pure-blooded Jews. Even though Joseph's sons each got a piece of the land, the number of territories still remained at 12 because the Levites, descendants of Jacob's son Levi, were priests and they didn't own any parts of the land. They got 10% of each tribe. So there was a Levite presence in each territory. That 10% is also symmetrical with the tithe that we pay in church today. Israel eventually breaks into two separate nations, Israel and the kingdom of Judah. After many years of disobedience, God allows both nations to be taken captive by their enemies. They lost their land, y'all. But God doesn't totally give up on them. He makes them a promise to be restored to their land one day. Fast forward, and King Cyrus the Great frees the Israelites and allows them to rebuild a temple in their land. Over the next few thousand years, the Israelites went to war with several nations. Jerusalem falls to the Romans and is under Roman control during the time of Jesus. The Muslim Caliphate controlled the land for a while, and that's why some of the holiest Muslim sites in the world are built on the Temple Mount. Then came the bloodiest of all the wars, the Christian Crusades, where the Knights Templar, in conjunction with the Roman Catholic Church, attempted to take the Holy Land back from the Muslims, and finally, the Ottoman Empire controlled the land before surrendering the land to the British. The main point I want to make here regarding the history of the chosen people is that they have always had to fight for their land. In 1917, at the tail end of World War I, the British made what was called the Balfour Declaration, which promises to reestablish the Jewish nation in the Holy Land. Many Christians believe this is the declaration that fulfills the Bible prophecy regarding Israel being reformed in one day. It comes from Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 8. It says, "Who have heard such a thing? Who have seen such things? Shall the earth be made to bring forth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? For as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children." Zion here is a reference to the Promised Land and the children of Israel. The verse is basically saying that God's chosen people will be restored to their chosen land after they have suffered like a woman having a baby. It wasn't until World War II and the Holocaust that the Jews actually regained their land, though. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany murdered some 6 million Jews across Germany-occupied Europe. There was about 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population. You must take a moment to ask the question, though, what the heck were the Jews doing in Europe? There are some people that believe the Jewish people that currently occupy the land of Israel are not the true Jews. You have to remember the term Jewish refers to both a religion and a people. For example, one of the most famous people that practice the Jewish faith is Sammy Davis Jr., but most people wouldn't consider him a true Jewish person. There is, however, a growing movement in the United States among African Americans who identify as Black Israelites, where descendants of slaves claim to be original Hebrews, the chosen people. And get this, there is actually solid evidence to support that. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying this is true. I'm just saying there's evidence to support the claim. In Revelation chapter 3, the Bible talks about those who claim to be Jews, though they are not, but they are liars. There's a map in the Library of Congress that shows the slave coast of Ghana is labeled as the Kingdom of Judah. The slave coast is where most of the African American slaves were taken from. Now, remember, Israel broke into two nations at some point. Israel with 10 of the original 12 tribes and the Kingdom of Judah with 2 tribes. The Bible also describes Jesus as the Lion of Judah because he falls in that lineage. Couple of things to note here. This map dates back to 1747, before the United States was a country. And it's in the Library of Congress, y'all. It's called the New Negro Land Map. Look it up for yourselves. To be fair, though, this scripture in Revelations could also be referring to the Black Israelites as being the fake Jews, too. I'm not suggesting that either side is correct. I am merely mentioning this as an interesting side note. But more importantly, it has some significance as it relates to Bible prophecy. Revelation says, I know the one who claims to be Jews, though they are not, multiple times. Just like in school, if your teacher says something multiple times, it's probably going to be on a test. In any case, European Jews migrated back to the Promised Land. The land was occupied the entire time by mostly Muslim Arabs, basically Palestinians. Great Britain, who controlled the land at the time, had no intention on forcing those people off their land. Instead, they opted for a shared solution that divided the land into 2 territories. That dynamic still exists today. Israel today is broken into 3 parts, actually. Israel, the nation, the West Bank, and finally, the Gaza Strip. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip are shared territories by Palestinians. But increasing settlements inside the West Bank by Israelis have basically driven Palestinians out of the West Bank, with one exception: Jerusalem. The holy city is the holiest site for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. It's meant to be a shared site of worship. For centuries, Muslims controlled the Al-Harim Al-Sharif compound, which is located on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This compound now houses 2 of the holiest sites in Islam, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's also the site of the Wailing Wall, where Jews often go to pray. A few weeks ago, there was a news story where Israeli police went inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque and subdued Muslim protesters during Ramadan, and just days before Palm Sunday. That conflict sparked questions about Israel's heavy-handedness towards Muslims in the territory, and indeed, it kicked off the latest round of battles between Israel and Palestine. The shared territory has been the norm for many years, but it's always been a tenuous situation. In 1948, President Truman recognized the Provisional Jewish Government as a de facto authority of the Jewish state. Truman's acknowledgement of Israel as a Jewish state basically declared that the Jews had a right to the land that was jointly occupied by the Palestinians at the time. The United States has been at the center of this conflict for decades, in most cases trying to broker peace deals. In 1967, after the first Intifada, which means uprising, there was the Camp David Accords. Then there was another Camp David Accords. Then there was the Oslo Accords. And most recently, there was the Abraham Accords during the Trump administration. The Trump administration also recognized Israel as a Jewish state, so they kind of played both sides of the fence. Although there's been several attempts at peace, there has been no long-lasting solution for peace in the Middle East. To this day, the entire area remains an Armageddon powder keg. Whenever there's peace, there's always a spark to restart the conflict. There are many people on both sides of the conflict that don't want peace. They feel the correct course of action is to fight for their land. And I personally don't blame either side for taking such a strong stance. As disturbing as the war in Ukraine is and the growing tension between China and the U.S., make no mistake about it. The Bible prophesies that the great war called the Battle of Armageddon will be fought on Israeli land. We should all keep an eye on the situation in Israel. Israel is surrounded by Muslim nations that hate them. Iraq and Iran to the east, Syria to the north, and Saudi Arabia to the south. Even more concerning than all the wars and rumors of wars is the growing concern over artificial intelligence and how the rise in AI will affect our world in the future. In my next video entitled The End of Days, I'll lay out how AI, in conjunction with all of these wars, could play a key role in end-time prophecies. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss that one. Whatever your beliefs are, we should all be praying for peace in the Middle East. Drop a comment. Let me know what you think. This is the Matthew 7 Project. Ask, Seek, Knock.